In 1930, the most powerful mathematician alive stood at a podium in Königsberg and declared to an audience and a live radio broadcast that every question in mathematics has an answer and humanity will find it. He said this one day after a 24-year-old in the same city had already proved him wrong. 6 years later, a different 23-year-old, lying in a field by the River Cam, imagined a machine that could follow any set of instructions and used that machine to prove that some instructions lead nowhere. That machine is the reason you own a phone. But the proof is the reason your phone cannot tell you whether the app you just downloaded will crash. And on June 8, 1954, the man who imagined that machine was found dead in his bed in Wilmslow, England, with a half-eaten apple beside him and cyanide in his blood, because the country he had helped save during the war could not process the fact that he was gay. These three threads, Hilbert's broken dream, the spectral gap paper that proved in 2015 that some properties of physical matter are permanently beyond any algorithm, and the half-eaten apple that was never tested for poison, are the same story. And that story ends with a conclusion about the device in your hand that nobody is willing to say out loud. Tonight is a long one. Get comfortable, and if you are not subscribed, now is the time. If you want more of this kind of thing, longer and wider explorations across physics, mathematics, and the histories that connect them, that is what the Patreon is for. Stay to the end of this one, because the place this lands is not where you think it is going. In 1936, a 23-year-old Cambridge graduate submitted a 36-page paper to the Proceedings of the London Mathematical Society. The paper was about numbers, specifically about which numbers can be calculated by a mechanical process and which ones cannot. That description makes it sound like an obscure contribution to pure mathematics, the kind of paper that gets cited 14 times over 40 years and then vanishes into the archives. It did not vanish. That paper is the reason you are hearing my voice right now. It is the reason the device in your hand exists. It is the reason every computer, every smartphone, every server, every satellite navigation system, every digital anything on the planet works the way it works. The paper invented the computer, and it did so as a side effect, a byproduct, an afterthought, because the actual purpose of the paper, the thing Alan Turing sat down to prove, was not that machines could calculate. It was that there are problems that no machine, no algorithm, no procedure of any kind can ever solve. Not today, not with better technology, not with 1,000 more years of progress, not ever. The computer was born from a proof of permanent, irreversible, mathematical defeat. And the fact that nobody told you that, the fact that every documentary and textbook and pop science video presents the invention of the computer as a triumph of human ingenuity rather than a monument to the limits of human knowledge, that is not an accident. It is a choice, and understanding why that choice was made requires going back further than Turing. It requires going back to the most ambitious intellectual project in the history of the human species, and to the morning it was destroyed. The year is 1900. The city is Paris. The occasion is the International Congress of Mathematicians, and the man standing at the podium is David Hilbert. Hilbert is at this point arguably the most important mathematician alive. He is 48 years old, a professor at the University of Göttingen, which in 1900 is the undisputed center of the mathematical world. And he has come to Paris not to present a result, but to issue a challenge. On August 8, 1900, Hilbert presents a list of 23 unsolved problems that he believes will shape the direction of mathematics for the coming century. He is right about that. But embedded in those 23 problems is something more than a to-do list. There is a philosophical conviction so deep that Hilbert does not even argue for it. He assumes it. The conviction is this: every well-posed mathematical question has a definite answer. Every true statement can be proved. Every false statement can be disproved. Mathematics is, in Hilbert's view, a closed system with no permanent mysteries. The only thing standing between us and complete mathematical knowledge is time and effort. Given enough of both, every question can be settled. This was not a fringe position. This was the official ideology of early 20th century mathematics, and it had a name. It was called formalism, and the program Hilbert built around it, the concrete technical agenda designed to prove that mathematics really was the way he said it was, became known as Hilbert's program. The program had 3 parts. First, reduce all of mathematics to a finite set of axioms and rules of inference, a formal system. Second, prove that the system is consistent, that it cannot generate contradictions. Third, and this is the part that matters for this story, prove that the system is complete, that for every mathematical statement, either the statement or its negation can be derived from the axioms. No gaps, no permanent unknowns, no questions that mathematics is structurally incapable of answering. I want you to feel the full weight of what Hilbert was claiming. He was not saying that mathematics is useful. He was not saying that mathematics is beautiful. He was saying that mathematics is omniscient, that there is nothing it cannot reach, that given any clearly stated problem, an algorithm exists, a finite mechanical procedure exists, that will determine whether the answer is yes or no. He called this the Entscheidungsproblem, the decision problem. Can a machine, given any statement in formal logic, determine in a finite number of steps whether that statement is true or false? Hilbert's answer was yes. His program was designed to prove it. And for 30 years, Hilbert's program was the organizing framework of serious mathematics. Careers were built inside it. Research agendas were funded to advance it. The leading mathematicians of the age, from Hilbert's own collaborator Paul Bernays to the young John von Neumann, all worked within its assumptions. The idea that mathematics might have permanent structural limitations was not seriously entertained. It was not even on the table. Then came September 7th, 1930. The location was Königsberg, the city where Hilbert was born. The occasion was a conference on epistemology, running in parallel with the Congress of the Society of German Scientists and Physicians, the very Congress where Hilbert himself was scheduled to deliver his retirement address the following day. And on September 7th, in a small round-table discussion, a 24-year-old Austrian logician named Kurt Gödel made an announcement that would destroy everything Hilbert had spent his career building. Gödel had actually revealed the result privately 12 days earlier, on August 26th, at the Café Reichsrat in Vienna, to 3 colleagues named Carnap, Fagel, and Weissmann. Their recorded reactions suggest they did not fully understand what he had told them. At the Königsberg Roundtable, the audience was slightly larger, but the response was similar. Blank stares. Polite confusion. One person in the room understood immediately what Gödel had done. That person was John von Neumann, who walked out of the session, went back to his hotel, and within weeks had independently derived the second part of the result before deferring to Gödel's priority. Nobody else grasped it. Not at first. What Gödel announced was this: any formal system powerful enough to express basic arithmetic, if it is consistent, must contain true statements that cannot be proved within the system. This is the first incompleteness theorem. There will always be mathematical truths that the system can express but cannot reach. And, as if that were not enough, the second theorem goes further. Such a system cannot prove its own consistency. You cannot even prove from inside the system that the system is not generating contradictions. Think about what that means for Hilbert. His entire program rested on two pillars: completeness and provable consistency. Gödel demolished both in a single paper, published in 1931, titled, and I want you to hear the modesty of this title, On Formally Undecidable Propositions of Principia Mathematica and Related Systems. A 25-year-old had just proved that the most ambitious intellectual project of the century was impossible. And here is the part that still haunts me about the timing. On September 8th, 1930, one day after Gödel's announcement in Königsberg, David Hilbert took the stage in the same city to deliver his retirement address. The speech was broadcast on radio. A 4-minute recording survives, and Hilbert concluded with the words that were later carved on his tombstone in Göttingen. Wir müssen wissen. We must know. We will know. He said it one day after Gödel had proved it was not true. There is some debate about whether Hilbert had heard about Gödel's result by the time he gave the speech. The historical consensus, supported by Constance Reid's authorized biography, is that he probably had not. Or if he had, he did not yet grasp its significance. Paul Bernays, Hilbert's closest collaborator, later recalled that when Hilbert finally understood Gödel's theorems, he was at first only angry and frustrated. But then he began to try to deal constructively with the problem. In the 1934 foreword to his Grundlegende Mathematik, co-authored with Bernays, Hilbert minimized the damage, arguing that Gödel's results merely showed that more far-reaching consistency proofs required exploiting the finite standpoint in a sharper manner. But behind the careful language, the damage was catastrophic. Gödel had proved that no formal system could be both consistent and complete. Mathematics had permanent blind spots, truths it could express but never prove, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. But here is the thing: Gödel had destroyed the completeness pillar of Hilbert's program. He had not yet destroyed the decision problem. The Entscheidungsproblem was still standing, and the Entscheidungsproblem was, in some ways, the more dangerous question, because Gödel had shown that some truths cannot be proved. But maybe, just maybe, there existed a general mechanical procedure that could at least tell you whether a given statement is provable or not provable. Maybe you could not answer every question, but you could sort them. You could build a machine that classifies mathematical statements into decidable and undecidable piles. That was the last hope, and it fell to a 23-year-old in Cambridge to kill it. I need to pause at the Entscheidungsproblem for a moment, because the word itself carries weight that the English translation flattens. Decision problem makes it sound administrative. The German is more revealing. Entscheidung means decision in the sense of a decisive resolution, a definitive settlement. Hilbert was not asking for a useful heuristic. He was asking for a procedure that settles every question, a machine that sorts all of mathematical truth into yes and no piles with absolute, permanent certainty. That was the dream. Not approximation, not usually right, always right, about everything. To appreciate how radical this demand was, consider what it would mean if the Entscheidungsproblem had a positive solution. It would mean you could build a device that, given any mathematical statement, any conjecture, any theorem, any proposition, expressible in formal logic, would determine in finite time whether that statement is true or false. Every unsolved problem in mathematics would fall. The Goldbach conjecture, the twin prime conjecture, the Riemann hypothesis, P versus NP. Every mathematical question humanity has ever struggled with would be answerable by running a sufficiently large computation. Mathematics would not need mathematicians. It would need machines. Hilbert genuinely believed this was possible, and he was not a fool. He was one of the greatest mathematical minds in history. He had axiomatized geometry in his 1900 Grundlagen der Geometrie, resolved a dozen major open problems, invented integral equations as a field, and laid groundwork that would influence quantum mechanics and general relativity. When Hilbert said, "We must know, and we will know," he was not making a wishful statement. He was expressing a deep philosophical conviction rooted in decades of successful mathematical practice. Every hard problem he had ever encountered had eventually yielded to the right technique. He had no reason to believe there were problems that could not yield. And that is what makes the destruction of his program so poignant. It was not a stupid dream destroyed by a clever trick. It was a noble dream, perhaps the noblest dream in the history of human thought. That reality itself rejected. The universe turned out to be built differently than Hilbert believed. Not because Hilbert was careless or wrong about the mathematics he had done, because the architecture of mathematics is stranger and more constrained than anyone had imagined. There are true statements that cannot be proved. There are decidable questions that cannot be decided. And there is nothing, not cleverness, not persistence, not better axioms, that can fix this. This is the context you need to understand what Turing did. He did not prove an obscure theorem. He killed a worldview that said all of knowledge is reachable by mechanical means. And he killed it by building the most general possible mechanical means and showing that even it cannot reach everywhere. And here is the deep irony that I think gets overlooked. The machine Turing built to prove the limits of machines became the most powerful intellectual tool in human history. And then that tool was used over the following 90 years to discover more and more things that it cannot do. The Busy Beaver challenge that proved BB of 5 equals 47,176,870 used a proof assistant called Coq, which runs on a computer, which is a physical instantiation of a Turing machine. A machine was used to prove a fact about the limits of machines. The formal verification of 27,000 lines of code that established the value of a function that no computer can compute in general was itself a computation. We are using the machine to map the boundaries of the machine. We are using Turing's invention to survey the territory that Turing's theorem says the invention can never fully explore. There is something almost recursive about this. The machine explores its own limits. The exploration is itself a computation subject to the same limits, and yet the exploration succeeds, partially, locally, for specific values of n, in a way that reveals the shape of the larger impossibility without ever resolving it. We can know BB of 5. We can bound BB of 6. We can prove that BB of 7 is unimaginably larger than BB of 6. But we cannot, in general, compute the function. The specific is reachable. The general is not. And the specific is reachable only because the machines Turing imagined have been built and are capable of the kind of sustained, verified, formal reasoning that human minds alone could never manage. The machines did not escape the cage, but they are very good at measuring its walls. Alan Turing was born on June 23, 1912, in Maida Vale, London. His father, Julius Turing, was in the Indian civil service, which meant that for most of Alan's childhood, both parents were in India and Alan and his older brother John were left with foster families in England. This is one of those biographical facts that biographers mention in passing and that I think deserves more weight. The man who would go on to define computation, who would build one of the most influential conceptual frameworks in human history, spent his formative years in the care of people who were not his parents, in a country his parents had largely left. The emotional architecture of isolation was laid early. At school, Turing was brilliant and difficult. At Sherborne, a traditional English public school, his headmaster wrote to his parents that if he is to stay at a public school, he must aim at becoming educated. If he is to be solely a scientific specialist, he is wasting his time at a public school. The headmaster had identified a pattern that would recur throughout Turing's life. The institutions he passed through could never quite figure out what to do with him. He did not fit the categories. He was not the right kind of student, not the right kind of academic, not the right kind of man. The systems he entered consistently failed to process him. At King's College, Cambridge, where he became a fellow in 1935 at the age of 22, Turing was known as an eccentric. He ran long distances, sometimes running the 17 miles from Cambridge to London for meetings rather than taking the train. He chained his tea mug to the radiator in his office to prevent others from using it. He spoke in long, complicated sentences that occasionally trailed off when his mind moved faster than his mouth. These details might seem like color, biographical window dressing for a technical story. They are not. They are evidence of a mind that was not built for social performance, but for sustained, obsessive, solitary engagement with problems. The same quality that made Turing difficult to know socially made him uniquely suited to the kind of thinking that produces a paper like Uncomputable Numbers. Because the paper did not emerge from collaboration or from the accumulated wisdom of a research group. It emerged from one person, thinking alone, for months, about a single question. The question was, what does it mean to compute? And the answer required imagining a machine so simple that it could not possibly be misunderstood. Every component, the tape, the head, the states, the transition rules, was stripped to its minimum. And that act of radical simplification, that willingness to throw away everything unnecessary until only the essential mechanism remained, that is the signature of a certain kind of mind. A mind that is uncomfortable with the social, the conventional, the cluttered. A mind that seeks the clean structure underneath. The friendship that mattered most to Turing's intellectual development was with a young man named Christopher Morcom, who Turing met at Sherborne in 1927. Morcom was brilliant, interested in science, and one of the few people who seems to have genuinely engaged with Turing's mind. In February 1930, Morcom died of bovine tuberculosis. He was 18 years old. Turing was devastated. In letters to Morcom's mother, written over the following years, Turing grappled with questions about the relationship between mind and mechanism, about whether consciousness could survive the death of the body, about whether the mind was more than the physical processes that produced it. He was 17 years old, grieving his closest friend, and already circling the questions that would define his life's work. The question of what can be mechanized, of where the boundary lies between the mechanical and the genuinely mental, was not for Turing an abstract philosophical exercise. It was personal. It had started with grief. I am telling you this not because it is interesting background, but because it connects directly to what Turing did in 1936, when he lay in Grantchester Meadows and imagined a machine that could follow any set of instructions. He was not just solving a mathematics problem. He was asking, in the most precise terms he could find, what thinking is. Whether thinking is a mechanical process, whether the thing that Christopher Morcom did the thing that made him Christopher, could in principle be captured by a machine? And the answer his paper gave was both yes and no. Yes, the concept of a universal machine encompasses any well-defined mechanical process. And no, there are things no such machine can do. The boundary exists, but it is not where you expect it. Alan Turing was not supposed to be the one who did this. He was not at Princeton. He was not at Göttingen. He was not in any of the places where the foundations of mathematics were being debated at the highest level. He was at King's College, Cambridge, a fellow since 1935, and the way he encountered the Entscheidungs problem was almost comically informal. In the spring of 1935, during Lent term, Turing attended a Part 3 lecture course called Foundations of Mathematics, taught by Max Hardy Newman. Newman, who had followed Gödel's work closely, spent part of the course explaining Hilbert's decision problem and remarked, almost in passing, that no one had been able to prove it was unsolvable. In a 1955 tape-recorded interview, Newman recalled that Turing's work started because he attended a lecture of mine. That is how it happened. A lecture remark, a passing comment about an open problem, and something in Turing's mind locked onto it. Turing later told his friend and colleague Robin Gandy that the central idea, the one that would eventually become the paper, came to him while lying in Grantchester Meadows during the summer of 1935. Grantchester Meadows is a stretch of grass along the River Cam, about 2 miles south of Cambridge, a place where students go to lie in the sun and think about nothing. Turing was lying there, thinking about everything. He was thinking about what it means to compute, not what machines can compute, what it means at the most fundamental level to carry out a calculation. What does a human being actually do when they follow an algorithm? And this is where Turing did something that nobody else had thought to do. Instead of starting with formal logic and trying to find its limits from above, he started from below. He imagined a person sitting at a desk with a pencil and an infinitely long strip of paper. The person can read one symbol at a time from the paper. They can write a symbol on the paper. They can move the paper 1 square to the left or 1 square to the right, and they follow a finite list of instructions that tells them based on which symbol they are currently reading and what to do next. Write a symbol, move left or right, change to a new internal state. That is it. That is the entire definition. Turing called this an automatic machine, or a machine. The name Turing machine was coined later by Alonzo Church in his 1937 review of the paper in the Journal of Symbolic Logic. But the name does not matter. What matters is what Turing proved you could do with this absurdly simple setup. And what you could do with it was everything, because Turing showed that you could build one of these machines, one specific machine that could simulate any other machine in the class. You feed it a description of another machine, encoded as a sequence of symbols on the tape, and it would behave identically to that machine. It was a machine that could become any machine. He called this the universal machine. And if you are thinking that sounds like a computer, a general-purpose programmable device that reads instructions from memory and executes them, you are right. That is exactly what it is. Turing had just described, on paper in 1936, the abstract architecture of every computer that would ever be built. The tape is the memory. The read-write head is the processor. The finite table of instructions is the program. The universal machine is the operating system. But Turing did not build this device to celebrate what machines could do. He built it to prove what they could not. Here is the argument, and I want to walk through it carefully because the structure of this proof is one of the most elegant things in the history of human thought, and also one of the most disturbing. Every Turing machine can be described by a finite string of symbols. Turing called this the description number. Think of it as the source code of the machine. Since the description is a finite string, you can list all possible Turing machines in a sequence. Machine 1, Machine 2, Machine 3, and so on. An infinite list, but a countable one. Now, some of these machines, when you start them running on a blank tape, will compute forever, producing an ever-growing output, an infinite decimal expansion of some real number. Turing called these circle-free machines. They never get stuck. They never loop. They just keep producing digits. Other machines will eventually halt or get trapped in a loop where they stop producing new output. These are the circular machines. Now comes the question, is there a machine, call it D, that can look at the description number of any other machine and decide whether that machine is circle-free or circular? Can a machine examine the source code of another machine and determine whether it will run forever or eventually stop? If such a machine D exists, then you can do something very clever with it. You can build a new machine, call it H, that does the following. H goes through the list of all Turing machines in order. For each one, H asks D whether that machine is circle-free. If D says yes, H simulates that machine long enough to extract one digit of its output, then moves on to the next circle-free machine. The digits H collects, one from each circle-free machine, are assembled into a new real number. But, and here is where the trap closes, H then changes each digit. If the digit from the nth circle-free machine was a 7, H writes a 6 instead. If it was anything else, H writes something different. The number that H computes is different from the output of every circle-free machine in the list. It disagrees with machine 1 in its first digit, with machine 2 in its second digit, with machine 3 in its third digit, and so on, forever. This is Cantor's diagonal argument, the same technique George Cantor used in 1891 to prove that the real numbers are uncountable, now applied not to numbers, but to machines. And here is the contradiction. H itself is a Turing machine. It has a description number. It appears somewhere in the list. Say, it is the kth circle-free machine. But when H reaches position K in the list, it is supposed to compute a digit that is different from its own kth digit. It cannot do this. It would have to disagree with itself. The machine breaks. Therefore, D cannot exist. There is no Turing machine, no algorithm, no mechanical procedure that can determine whether an arbitrary Turing machine will run forever or eventually halt. This is the halting problem, and from it, Turing derived the result that killed Hilbert's last hope. The Entscheidungsproblem is unsolvable. There is no algorithm that can decide, for every statement in first-order logic, whether that statement is provable. I want to be precise about what Turing actually proved because the implications are often stated too loosely. He did not prove that humans cannot solve these problems. He did not prove that some future breakthrough will not change things. What he proved is that no algorithm can solve them. No finite, mechanical, step-by-step procedure. No program, no computer. And the Church-Turing thesis, which emerged from the equivalence of Turing's machines, Church's lambda calculus, and Gödel and Herbrand's recursive functions, all shown to define the same class of computable functions within 2 years of each other, tells us something even stronger. Every known formalization of the concept of an effective procedure gives the same answer. They all hit the same wall. If you cannot do it with a Turing machine, you cannot do it, period. Not because we lack imagination, but because computation itself has a boundary, and Turing found it. The paper was submitted on May 28, 1936, but it almost did not get published because Alonzo Church, working independently at Princeton, had already proved the same negative result, using a completely different method. Church's paper, An Unsolvable Problem of Elementary Number Theory, was published in the American Journal of Mathematics in 1936. His note on the Entscheidungs problem specifically was submitted on April 15, 1936, more than a month before Turing's submission. Church used his lambda calculus, an entirely different formalization of computation, and arrived at the same conclusion. The decision problem is unsolvable. When Turing learned about Church's result, the effect was devastating. Newman wrote to Church on May 31, 1936, just 3 days after Turing's submission, explaining that an off-print of Church's paper had a rather painful interest for a young man, A.M. Turing, here, who was just about to send in for publication a paper in which he had used a definition of computable numbers for the same purpose. The critical word is painful. Turing had been scooped. The central result he had spent months proving had been proved by someone else first. But Newman argued successfully that Turing's paper was different enough to merit independent publication. And he was right, because while Church had proved the Entscheidungs problem unsolvable, Church's proof was technical and algebraic. Turing's proof was conceptual. Turing had not just proved the result. He had built the universal machine. He had given the first, precise, intuitively convincing definition of what an algorithm actually is. And that definition, not the negative result itself, is what changed the world. Gödel himself recognized this. In a note added to his 1931 paper in 1963, Gödel credited Turing, not himself, and not Church, with providing a precise and unquestionably adequate definition of the notion of formal system. The abstract concept of an effective procedure which had been used informally for millennia had resisted precise definition until Turing built his imaginary machine, and Gödel, a man not known for generous assessments of other people's work, acknowledged that Turing's formulation was the definitive one. Turing added an appendix to his paper in August 1936, before it was published, sketching the equivalence of his machines, Church's lambda calculus, and Gödel-Herbrand recursive functions. This appendix is the seed of what we now call the Church-Turing thesis. 3 completely different formalizations, developed independently in different countries using different mathematical frameworks, all delineated exactly the same boundary between the computable and the uncomputable. That convergence is not a coincidence. It is evidence that the boundary is real. It is not an artifact of Turing's particular definition or Church's particular calculus. It is a feature of reality itself. The paper was read at the London Mathematical Society on November 12, 1936, and published in 2 parts. Pages 230 through 240 appeared on November 30th, 1936, and pages 241 through 265 appeared on December 23rd, 1936. The bound volume carries a 1937 date, which is why many sources cite the paper as 1937, but both installments appeared in 1936. A 2-page correction followed in volume 43 in 1937, after Paul Bernays, Hilbert's own collaborator, sent Turing some technical corrections. 36 pages. That is all it was. 36 pages that simultaneously invented the theoretical foundation of computer science, proved that mathematics has permanent and irremovable limitations, and killed the last surviving piece of the most ambitious intellectual project in the history of the human species. And the person who wrote them was 23 years old working largely alone at a university that was not even the primary center of research in the field. But the paper did something else, something that would not become clear for another decade. It had created a blueprint, and a blueprint, once it exists, demands to be built. I want to pause here and make sure the practical weight of what Turing proved lands properly. Because when I say the halting problem is unsolvable, there is a tendency to hear that as a statement about abstract mathematics, something that matters in the foundations department but has no bearing on the actual world. That is wrong. The halting problem is the reason for things you encounter every day without realizing it. Have you ever had a computer program freeze? Just stop responding, the wheels spinning, the cursor locked. You wait longer. You do not know whether the program is doing something useful that is taking a long time, or whether it has entered an infinite loop and will never finish. You cannot tell. And Rice's theorem tells you that no program can tell either. The operating system on your computer cannot, in general, determine whether a running process will eventually complete or will run forever. This is not a bug. It is not a limitation of current technology. It is a mathematical certainty. It has been proved since 1936 that this question has no general solution. This is also the reason that every complex software system ships with bugs. Not because programmers are careless, not because companies do not invest enough in testing, because proving that a program meets its specification in all cases is, by Rice's theorem, impossible. You can test a program on 1 million inputs, and it can work perfectly on all of them. The 1,000,001st input might cause it to crash, and no amount of static analysis, no automated tool, no formal verification method can guarantee otherwise in the general case. Every time you trust software with something that matters, your bank account, your medical records, the trajectory of an aircraft, you are trusting a system that has been proved to be unverifiable. The halting problem is also the reason that cybersecurity is an arms race rather than a solved problem. Perfect malware detection is impossible. Perfect intrusion detection is impossible. If you could determine, in general, whether a given program would perform a harmful action, you could solve the halting problem. And you cannot solve the halting problem. So instead, we have heuristics, behavioral analysis, machine learning classifiers, signature databases, and an endless cat and mouse game between attackers and defenders. The game will never end, not because the defenders are not clever enough, because the game has been proved unwinnable. This was all implicit in 36 pages written in 1936 by a 23-year-old who had never seen an electronic computer. And I want to say something about the other figures in this story, because Turing was not the only person destroyed by the institutions he served. Kurt Gödel, the man who fired the first shot at Hilbert's program in 1930, had a life that could serve as a case study in the relationship between genius and institutional failure. After the Anschluss in 1938, Gödel, who was not Jewish but whose social circle in the Vienna Circle was largely Jewish and had been decimated by the Nazis, fled Austria. He and his wife, Adele, traveled by train across the Soviet Union, by ship across the Pacific, and arrived in the United States in early 1940. He joined the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton and stayed there for the rest of his life. But Gödel's mind, which could navigate the most abstract logical structures ever conceived, was progressively consumed by paranoia. He became convinced that people were trying to poison him. He would eat only food prepared by Adele. When Adele was hospitalized in late 1977, Gödel stopped eating. He died on January 14, 1978, at Princeton Hospital. He weighed approximately 65 pounds. The death certificate listed the cause as malnutrition and inanition caused by personality disturbance. The man who proved that consistent systems cannot prove their own consistency starved himself to death because he could not trust the consistency of the world around him. Von Neumann, the prodigy who had grasped Gödel's theorem immediately at Königsberg, the man who translated Turing's universal machine into a real computer architecture, was diagnosed with bone cancer in 1955, possibly caused by his exposure to radiation during the Manhattan Project. He deteriorated rapidly. Edward Teller reported that when von Neumann could no longer think clearly, the terror on his face was something I have never seen before in any human being. The man who could outcompute nearly anyone alive was terrified of losing the ability to compute. He died on February 8, 1957, at Walter Reed Army Medical Hospital in Washington, D.C. He was 53 years old. A military guard was stationed at his bedside because the government was afraid he would reveal nuclear secrets in his delirium. David Hilbert, the man whose dream they had all collectively destroyed, died on February 14, 1943, in Göttingen. By then, Göttingen's mathematics department had been gutted by Nazi purges. When the Minister of Education, Bernhard Rust, asked Hilbert at a dinner in 1934 whether mathematics at Göttingen had suffered from the departure of Jewish professors, Hilbert's reply was immediate. Suffered? It has not suffered, Herr Minister. It does not exist anymore. Hilbert's funeral was attended by fewer than a dozen people. Only 2 were fellow academics. One of them was Arnold Sommerfeld, a theoretical physicist and, like Hilbert, a native of Königsberg. There is a pattern here. The people who revealed the limits of formal systems were themselves broken by the formal systems they lived inside. Gödel by his own mind, von Neumann by the military apparatus he had helped build, Hilbert by the political system that consumed his university, and Turing by the legal system of the country he had saved. First it was impossible. Then when someone did it, it was trivial. The one thing it could never be was important, and the people who did it were never, not once, treated in proportion to what they had achieved. On September 23, 1936, Turing sailed for New York. He was headed to Princeton, where Church, Gödel, von Neumann, Hermann Weyl, and Albert Einstein were all in residence at the Institute for Advanced Study. It is difficult to overstate the concentration of intellectual firepower in that building in the late 1930s. The greatest logicians, physicists, and mathematicians on the planet, many of them refugees from an increasingly dangerous Europe, all sharing the same corridors, the same seminars, the same cafeteria. And into this environment walked a 24-year-old Englishman who was, by all accounts, socially awkward, physically unprepossessing, and prone to working alone. Turing's 2 years at Princeton were productive but uncomfortable. His PhD thesis, Systems of Logic Based on Ordinals, was supervised by Church and accepted on May 7, 1938. The thesis introduced the concept of oracle machines, Turing machines augmented with a hypothetical black box that can answer questions about an undecidable problem. This was not just a technical curiosity. It was the beginning of relative computability theory, the study of how different unsolvable problems relate to each other. Some unsolvable problems are, in a precise sense, more unsolvable than others. Oracle machines gave Turing a framework for mapping that hierarchy. The relationship between Turing and Church was professional, but distant. In a 1984 oral history interview conducted by William Asprey and archived at Princeton's mathematics department, Church recalled that Turing had the reputation of being a loner. Then he added, with a candor that reveals how peripheral Turing was to Church's world, "I forgot about him when I was speaking about my own graduate students. Truth is, he was not really mine." Think about that. the man who had written the most important paper in the foundations of mathematics in the 20th century, the man who had given computation its definitive formalization, was so invisible at Princeton that his own doctoral supervisor forgot to mention him. But one person at Princeton did not overlook Turing. John von Neumann, who by 1938 was already one of the most influential mathematicians in the world, offered Turing a position as his assistant. Turing turned it down. He wanted to go home. He sailed back to England in the summer of 1938, carrying with him a partially built electromechanical binary multiplier and a rotor-based cipher machine in pieces. A man carrying the future of computing in a suitcase, and nobody on the ship knew it. I want to pause here and talk about what happened next, because it is the part of Turing's story that most people think they know, and most people have it slightly wrong. The popular version goes like this. Turing invented the computer, then he used computers to break the Nazi codes and won World War II. That version is emotionally satisfying and cinematically convenient, and it is not quite accurate. The relationship between the 1936 paper and Bletchley Park is real, but it is subtler than the movie version suggests. Turing joined the government code and cipher school on September 3, 1939, the day Britain declared war on Germany. He was assigned to Hut 8, which was responsible for breaking the German naval Enigma cipher. The device he designed, with critical improvements by Gordon Welchman, was the bomb, an electromechanical machine that could test possible Enigma settings at high speed. The bomb was brilliant. It was essential to the Allied war effort, and it was not a computer. The bomb was a special-purpose device, a parallel bank of Enigma analogues testing cribs, known or guessed fragments of plain text. It did not store a program. It did not execute instructions from memory. It was not a universal machine in any meaningful sense. Andrew Hodges, in his definitive biography Alan Turing, The Enigma, puts it carefully. Turing's serious interest in mathematical machines, his fascination with the idea of working like a machine, was extraordinarily relevant to the bomb's design, but the device was not a universal Turing machine. The 1936 paper did not give Turing a device. It gave him a way of thinking. It gave him the conviction that any sufficiently well-defined problem could be attacked mechanically, and it gave him the intellectual confidence to design machines that did exactly that. The bomb was not a Turing machine, but only a mind trained on the concept of universal computation could have built it. The connection is methodological, not architectural. The direct architectural descendants of the 1936 paper came later. Tommy Flower's Colossus, the world's first programmable electronic digital computer, which ran at Bletchley from February 1944 and was designed to break the Lorenz cipher, had some stored program features, but the full realization of Turing's universal machine required the war to end and the ideas to cross the Atlantic and come back again. And this is where John von Neumann re-enters the story. Von Neumann had read Turing's 1936 paper at Princeton. He had given copies to the members of his Institute for Advanced Study computer project and told them to read it. His chief engineer, Julian Bigelow, later said, "I know that in or about 1943 or 44, von Neumann was well aware of the fundamental importance of Turing's paper of 1936. Turing's machine does not sound much like a modern computer today, but nevertheless it was the germinal idea." In June 1945, von Neumann wrote the first draft of a report on the EDVAC, a 101-page document describing the architecture of a stored program computer. The report carried only von Neumann's name. a decision that enraged his collaborators, John Presper Eckert and John Bletchley, who had built the ENIAC and contributed substantially to the EDVAC design. The credit dispute would poison the field for decades. But whatever the politics, the EDVAC report translated Turing's abstract logical machine into a concrete engineering specification. The tape became addressable memory. The read-write head became the central processing unit. The finite table of instructions became the stored program. The universal machine became real. The first stored program computer to actually run was the Manchester Baby, officially the small-scale experimental machine built by Frederick Williams, Tom Kilburn, and Jeff Tootle at the University of Manchester. On June 21, 1948, the Baby executed its first program, which found the highest proper factor of a number by trial subtraction. The test run that morning used a small number to allow for circuit adjustments. The afternoon run used 2 to the 18th power, which is 262,144, and took 52 minutes, involving roughly 3.5 million operations and over 2 million memory accesses. It correctly output 131,072. That afternoon, June 21st, 1948, that is the day the universal machine stepped off the page and into the world. 12 years after Turing described it as a thought experiment in a proof about the limits of mathematics, it was running in a laboratory in Manchester, doing actual calculations on actual numbers stored in actual electronic memory. And Turing was there. Not for the Baby's first run, he arrived later, but he joined the University of Manchester in September 1948 as Deputy Director of the Computing Machine Laboratory. He spent the next few years designing software at the Manchester Mark I, the Baby's successor. The man who had imagined the universal machine was now programming one. I want you to hold the full weight of the irony here. Turing invented the concept of a universal programmable computer in order to prove that some problems cannot be solved. The machine was the weapon. The target was Hilbert's optimism. And the proof succeeded. The Entscheidungs problem was killed. The machine, having served its purpose as a theoretical device, should have remained an abstraction, a thought experiment deployed in the service of mathematical logic, and then retired. But it turned out that a device capable of simulating any mechanical process was useful for more than proving impossibility theorems. It turned out that such a device could break military ciphers, calculate artillery trajectories, simulate nuclear detonations, predict weather patterns, and eventually connect every human being on the planet to every other human being on the planet. The side effect ate the proof. The byproduct became the most consequential technological invention in human history. And this creates a situation that I think is genuinely unprecedented. Every computer ever built is a physical instantiation of a theoretical device that was designed to demonstrate the limits of computation. Your phone is a monument to the proof that knowledge has a wall. Every time you ask a question and get an answer, you are using a machine whose existence proves that some questions can never be answered. The very tool you use to seek knowledge is an artifact of the discovery that there are things beyond knowledge's reach. Nobody frames it that way. Nobody teaches it that way. The story of the computer is told as a story of liberation, of progress, of problems solved and capabilities expanded, and all of that is true. But it is the safe version of the story, the comfortable version, the version that leaves out the part where the thing was born, from a proof of permanent intellectual failure. But that is not the unsettling part. The unsettling part is what Turing's proof started. because the halting problem was not the end. It was the beginning of a cascade of impossibility results that has been growing for 90 years and shows no sign of stopping. And the cascade has now reached places that should make you deeply uncomfortable. It has reached physics. It has reached the fabric of matter itself. After Turing's paper, the question stopped being, can we solve the decision problem, and became, how far does the unsolvability go? And the answer, as it emerged over the following decades, was much further than anyone wanted to believe. The first extension came from Henry Gordon Rice, an American mathematician who in 1953 proved what is now called Rice's theorem. And Rice's theorem is one of those results that sounds technical until you realize what it actually says about the world you live in. Here is what it says. Take any non-trivial property of the behavior of a computer program, any property at all, as long as it is about what the program does rather than what the program looks like. Does the program ever output the number 7? Does the program halt on every input? Does the program compute a total function? Is the program a virus? Does the program correctly implement a given specification? For every one of these questions, without exception, there is no algorithm that can answer it for all possible programs. Every non-trivial semantic property of programs is undecidable. I need you to understand what Rice's theorem means in practice, because you interact with its consequences every single day. It means that perfect antivirus software is impossible, not difficult to build, not commercially unviable, mathematically impossible. No program can examine another program and determine, in all cases, whether it is malicious. This is why every antivirus tool on the market relies on heuristics, signatures, and behavioral monitoring rather than genuine analysis. They are approximating a problem that has been proved unsolvable. It means perfect software verification is impossible. No compiler can determine, for all programs, whether a given program meets its specification. It means perfect static analysis. The dream of examining code without running it and guaranteeing it will behave correctly is impossible. Rice's theorem does not say these things are hard. It says they are provably, permanently, structurally beyond the reach of any algorithm. And Rice's theorem is just one ripple in the pond Turing created. Emil Post, a Polish-American mathematician working at the City College of New York, published a result in 1946 that would become another cornerstone of undecidability. Post's correspondence problem sounds almost childishly simple. You are given a finite collection of tiles, each tile having a string of symbols on its top half and a different string on its bottom half. The question is whether you can arrange copies of these tiles in a sequence such that the string formed by the top halves equals the string formed by the bottom halves. It sounds like a puzzle you might find in a children's magazine. It is undecidable. No algorithm can solve it in general. And Post's correspondence problem became one of the most widely used reduction tools in theoretical computer science, a standard intermediate step for proving that other problems are also undecidable. If you can show that solving your problem would allow you to solve Post's correspondence problem, then your problem is undecidable too. Turing's impossibility exported through Post's innocuous-looking tiles into dozens of other domains. And then there is Hilbert's 10th problem. Remember Hilbert's list of 23 problems from 1900. Number 10 on that list asked for an algorithm that can determine whether any given Diophantine equation, a polynomial equation with integer coefficients, has integer solutions. For 70 years, mathematicians worked on this. Many assumed the algorithm existed and just needed to be found. In 1970, a 22-year-old Soviet mathematician named Yuri Matyasevich building on decades of work by Martin Davis, Hilary Putnam, and Julia Robinson, proved that no such algorithm exists. Hilbert's 10th problem is undecidable. There is no mechanical procedure that can look at a polynomial equation and determine whether it has integer solutions. This was one of Hilbert's own problems, one of the 23 he had posed in 1900, the list that was supposed to organize mathematics for a century. And the answer to this, one, was not a solution. It was a proof that no solution can exist. Hilbert had unwittingly included an impossible task on his own list. The man who believed every mathematical question had an answer had posed a question that provably does not. But the real revelation about the depth of uncomputability came from two places. One of them is a function, the other is a number, and both of them are, in the precise mathematical sense, monsters. The function is the Busy Beaver function, introduced in 1962 by the Hungarian-American mathematician Tibor Rado. And to understand why it matters, you need to understand what it measures. Take a Turing machine with n states and two symbols, 0 and 1, operating on a blank tape. Some of these machines will halt, eventually stopping after producing some output. Others will run forever. Among all the n-state machines that halt, one of them takes the most steps before halting. The number of steps that machine takes is called BB of n, the Busy Beaver function. It asks a deceptively simple question. How long can a simple machine run before it stops? The answers, for small values of n, seem modest. BB of 1 is 1, BB of 2 is 6, BB of 3 is 21, BB of 4 is 107. And then you reach BB of 5. And the answer to BB of 5 was not known for 60 years. Tibor Rado posed the function in 1962. Heiner Markson and Jürgen Buntrock established a lower bound in 1989. And for decades, nobody could prove the exact value. On July 2nd, 2024, the Busy Beaver Challenge collaboration, led by Tristan Sterrin, announced the proof. BB of 5 equals 47,176,870. The proof was formalized in the Coq proof assistant, now called ROC, by a contributor using the handle MXDSEs. The formal proof, called Coq, BB5, totals 27,274 lines of code and 638 lemmas. It took the global distributed effort years to verify every single 5-state Turing machine and prove that none of them runs longer than 47,176,870 steps. That jump from 107 for 4 states to 47 million for 5 states should alarm you, because the growth of the Busy Beaver function is not exponential. It is not even super exponential. It grows faster than any computable function, faster than any function you can define using an algorithm, faster, provably faster, than anything a computer can produce. And then there is BB of 6. In June 2025, the same contributor, MXDYS, pushed the lower bound for BB of 6 to a number that I genuinely struggle to communicate to you, because the mathematical notation required to express it goes beyond exponentiation, beyond tetration, and into a regime called pentation. The lower bound for BB of 6 is greater than 2 pentatated to the 5, which means 2 tetrated to 2 tetrated to 2 tetrated to 9. If you are not familiar with these operations, here is the rough idea. Exponentiation is repeated multiplication. Tetration is repeated exponentiation. Pentation is repeated tetration. Each level of this hierarchy grows incomprehensibly faster than the one below it. 2 to the power of 10 is 1024. 2 tetrated to the 4 is already a number with over 19,000 digits. 2 pentated to the 5 is a number that you could not write down if every atom in the observable universe were a digit. And that is just a lower bound. The actual value of BB of 6 is almost certainly far larger. Scott Aronson, a computer scientist at the University of Texas at Austin, who has written extensively about the Busy Beaver function, reported the result on his blog Shtetl Optimized on June 28, 2025. William Gassage at the University of Maryland was quoted in Quanta magazine in August 2025, saying, "I keep on being surprised. It is a measuring instrument. It measures the boundary between the computable and the uncomputable. And what it measures is this: the uncomputable is not just beyond our reach. It is beyond our reach by an amount that itself is beyond our reach. The gap between what we can compute and what exists is so large that no computable function can describe how large it is." And that brings us to the number, Chaitin's Omega. In 1975, the Argentine-American mathematician Gregory Chaitin defined a real number called omega. Here is what it represents. Take a universal prefix-free Turing machine, a standard reference computer. Now consider all possible programs for that computer, and for each program, calculate the probability that a randomly generated program will halt. This probability is omega. It is a specific, definite real number between 0 and 1. It exists. It has a decimal expansion. Each bit of that expansion is either 0 or 1, and you cannot compute it. Omega is computably enumerable, which means you can write a program that generates increasingly accurate lower bounds. You can approach omega from below, but you can never know when your approximation is close enough. You can never determine any given bit of omega with certainty. In 2002, Christian Kalude, Michael Deneen, and Chico Xu managed to compute 64 bits of one particular version of omega, but those 64 bits are the product of a specific formal system, and proving them correct required assuming the consistency of that system. Here is why omega matters. If you knew enough bits of omega, you could settle every mathematical conjecture of a certain type. Is the Goldbach conjecture true? Does every even number greater than 2 equal the sum of 2 primes? If you knew enough bits of omega, you would know. Is the Riemann hypothesis true? Does every non-trivial zero of the zeta function have real part 1/2? If you knew enough bits of omega, you would know. The answers to these questions, and all other questions, expressible as statements about the non-termination of specific programs, are encoded in the binary expansion of a single real number. A number that exists, that is well defined, and that no algorithm can compute. I want to sit with that for a moment because I think the weight of it gets lost in the technicality. There is a number. It exists. It contains the answers to virtually every outstanding mathematical question, and we cannot read it. Not because we lack the tools, not because we need better technology, because reading it has been proved with mathematical certainty to be impossible. The answer to mathematics is a number that mathematics cannot reach. Turing proved in 1936 that some questions cannot be answered by any algorithm. Rice proved in 1953 that the set of unanswerable questions is not a narrow, exotic class, but encompasses virtually every interesting property of programs. The Busy Beaver function showed that the unanswerable grows faster than anything the answerable can describe. And Chaitin's Omega showed that a single number can encode the answers to infinitely many questions that are individually unanswerable. All of this flows from one paper, 36 pages. A 23-year-old lying in a meadow by the River Cam, thinking about what it means to follow an instruction. But here is where the story takes a turn that most people, even most mathematicians, have not fully absorbed. Because for decades, the undecidability results lived inside mathematics. They were theorems about formal systems, about algorithms, about the limits of proof. They were philosophically significant, but practically contained. They lived in the world of symbols on paper, not the world of atoms and forces and physical matter. And then the wall broke. The undecidability leaked out. It escaped from mathematics into physics. And what it found there should unsettle you far more than anything I have described so far. I want to come back to Chaitin's Omega, because I do not think I gave it the weight it deserves, and I think it is, in some ways, the most philosophically devastating result in this entire story. Imagine there is a book. The book has infinitely many pages, and on each page is a single digit, 0 or 1. The sequence of digits in this book answers every mathematical conjecture of a certain type. Page 1 tells you whether Goldbach's conjecture is true or false. Page 37 tells you whether the Riemann hypothesis holds. Page 9214 tells you whether some theorem about prime gaps that nobody has even formulated yet is true or false. Every question that can be phrased as does this particular Turing machine hold is answered by a specific digit in this book. That book is Omega. It is a real number. It exists in the same way that pi exists or the square root of 2 exists. It is not a hypothetical or a thought experiment. It is a mathematically well-defined object, and every bit of its binary expansion encodes the answer to a question about halting, and you cannot read it. Chaitin proved that Omega is algorithmically random, which means that no pattern, no formula, no compression scheme can generate its digits. Each bit of Omega is maximally unpredictable from all the previous bits. It is, in a precise technical sense, the most random possible sequence, and this is not a statement about our current state of knowledge. It is a proven theorem. No future advance in mathematics or computing will ever allow us to compute Omega. The answers are right there, encoded in a specific sequence of zeros and ones, and the encoding is provably unbreakable. Now, here is the part that I still have trouble processing. Omega is not unknowable in the way that, say, the interior of a black hole is unknowable. It is not inaccessible because of a physical barrier. It is unknowable because of a logical barrier. The same logical barrier that Turing found in 1936. The same diagonalization argument. The same self-referential trap. The same fundamental limitation of mechanical processes. The answers to the great open questions of mathematics are encoded in a number that mathematics itself has proved it cannot read. There is a version of this that sounds almost religious. The book of all knowledge exists, but we are forbidden from reading it. I want to be clear that I am not making a religious argument. I am making a mathematical one. The number exists. The proof that it is uncomputable exists. The implication that the totality of mathematical truth exceeds the reach of any algorithm is a theorem, not a metaphor. But the emotional register of the result is hard to distinguish from revelation. You are living in a universe that contains a number that knows the answer to every question you could ever ask about the halting of programs, and you are provably unable to read it. Not for now. Not until you are smarter. Not until computers are faster. Forever. And now let me address something that I suspect some of you have been thinking throughout this. What about Quantum computing. Quantum computers process information in fundamentally different ways than classical computers. They exploit superposition and entanglement. They can solve certain problems exponentially faster than any known classical algorithm. Shor's algorithm can factor large numbers in polynomial time. Grover's algorithm can search unstructured databases quadratically faster. Does quantum computing change the picture I have been drawing? No, it does not. And the reason it does not is important. Quantum computers are more powerful than classical computers in terms of efficiency, in terms of the class of problems they can solve quickly, but they are not more powerful in terms of what they can solve at all. Every computation that a quantum computer can perform can also be performed by a classical Turing machine, given enough time. The difference is speed, not capability. A quantum computer can factor a 1,000-digit number in hours, where a classical computer would take longer than the age of the universe. But if the classical computer has enough time, it gets the same answer. This distinction between computational complexity and computability is crucial. Quantum computing challenges what is called the strong Church-Turing thesis, the conjecture that classical Turing machines can simulate any physical process efficiently. It does not challenge the Church-Turing thesis itself, which says that Turing machines can compute anything that any physical process can compute. Period. The halting problem is unsolvable on a quantum computer. Rice's theorem applies to quantum algorithms. Chaitin's Omega is uncomputable by quantum means. The spectral gap is undecidable, even if you had a perfect quantum computer with unlimited qubits and unlimited coherence time. The wall that Turing found in 1936 is not a wall of speed or power. It is a wall of logic, and no physical mechanism, classical or quantum, can breach a logical wall. You cannot build a machine that determines its own halting behavior. For the same reason, you cannot draw a square circle. It is not a limitation of engineering. It is a limitation of coherence. The concept contains a contradiction. This means that the entire field of quantum computing, which is among the most heavily funded and intensely researched areas of physics and engineering in the world, operates entirely within Turing's cage. Every quantum algorithm that will ever be designed, every quantum speedup that will ever be demonstrated, will work within the boundaries that Turing drew. The cage is bigger than we thought. The problems we can solve efficiently may be vastly more numerous than we imagined. But the cage exists. The walls are proved, and nothing we build, in silicon or in superconducting qubits or in topological quantum memory, will ever break them. Let me come back to the Busy Beaver for a moment, because I want to connect it to the spectral gap result in a way that makes the full picture visible. The Busy Beaver function BB of n tells you the maximum number of steps that any halting n-state Turing machine can take. It is uncomputable, but it is more than uncomputable. It is a growth rate that exceeds any computable growth rate. Any function you can define using an algorithm, the Busy Beaver function eventually outgrows it. Not eventually in a vague sense. For any computable function f, no matter how fast growing, there exists a value of n beyond which BB of n is larger than f of n. Every time, without exception. This means that the boundary between the computable and the uncomputable is not a gentle gradient. It is a cliff. On one side, you have all computable functions, all the functions that algorithms can produce, growing as fast as you like, but always finite and always reachable. On the other side, you have BB, growing so fast that no computable function can keep pace. The gap between what we can compute and what exists is not large in any ordinary sense of the word. It is large in the sense that the word large was not designed to accommodate, and the spectral gap result says that this cliff, this boundary between the computable and the uncomputable, runs through physics. It runs through quantum mechanics. It runs through the behavior of atoms arranged in lattices. The cliff is not just in the mathematics. It is in the world. When I think about this, when I try to hold the full picture in my mind at once, I keep coming back to a feeling that I can only describe as vertigo, not the dizzy, disorienting kind. The kind where you look down from a great height and realize with perfect clarity that the height is not going to change, that it is a feature of the landscape, not a function of where you happen to be standing. The limits Turing found are not a product of our ignorance. They are a property of reality, and we are living inside them. There is something I need to say before we go further, because the territory we are about to enter is different in kind from what came before. Everything I have described so far, the halting problem, Rice's theorem, the Busy Beaver function, Chaitin's Omega, all of it lives inside mathematics, inside formal systems, inside the world of symbols and rules and proofs. And you could, if you wanted to, take comfort in that. You could say, well, mathematics has limits, but mathematics is an abstraction. It is a language we invented to describe the world. The limits of the language do not necessarily mean limits of the world. The map has holes, but the territory might be complete. That is a reasonable position. It was, in fact, the default position of most physicists for decades. The undecidability results were acknowledged, filed in the philosophy of mathematics drawer, and treated as irrelevant to the practice of physics. Physics deals with the real world, and the real world, whatever its complexities, was assumed to be algorithmically tractable in principle. Given a complete description of a physical system and enough computing power, you could predict its behavior. The universe, at bottom, was a computable object. That assumption is now dead, and the way it died is worth understanding in detail, because the mechanism reveals something about the relationship between abstract mathematics and physical reality that I think most people, including most physicists, have not fully processed. The key insight is this: if a physical system can encode a universal Turing machine, then the behavior of that physical system inherits the undecidability of the halting problem. This is not a metaphor. This is not an analogy. This is a mathematical theorem. If the dynamics of a quantum lattice system can simulate any Turing machine, which Cubitt, Pérez-García and Wolf proved it can, then predicting the long-term behavior of that system is at least as hard as solving the halting problem, which means it is impossible. The assumption that physics is immune to Gödel and Turing rested on an implicit belief that physical systems are somehow simpler than mathematical ones, that the universe, for all its complexity, does not contain structures rich enough to encode universal computation. That belief was wrong. The universe is rich enough. Quantum lattice systems are rich enough. The structure of matter at the quantum level is sufficient to embed any computation, including the ones that cannot be completed, and therefore the limits of computation are limits of physics. I keep thinking about what this means for the project of science itself. Science is, at its core, the project of building models that predict observations. You observe the world, you build a mathematical model, you derive predictions from the model, and you test them. If the predictions match, the model is good. If they do not, you revise the model. This procedure has been spectacularly successful for 400 years. From Newton's mechanics, to Maxwell's electromagnetism, to Einstein's relativity, to the standard model of particle physics, the procedure works. It works so well that we have come to treat its success as inevitable. Of course we can model the world. Of course we can predict observations. Of course, the next experiment will have an answer that our theories can reach. The undecidability results say that this inevitability is an illusion. The procedure works in practice because the physical systems we typically study are simple enough to avoid the undecidability trap. But the trap exists. There are physical systems constructible within the standard framework of quantum mechanics, whose behavior our models cannot predict. Not because the models are wrong, because the behavior is genuinely unpredictable by any algorithm. The procedure of science, the model predict test loop, has a boundary, and we found it because a 23-year-old in Cambridge imagined a machine that reads and writes symbols on an infinite tape. The connection between uncomputability and physics was not a sudden revelation. It crept in gradually through a series of results that most physicists preferred not to think about too carefully. The first hints came in the 1970s and 80s, when computer scientists showed that certain idealized physical systems could simulate Turing machines. If a physical process can simulate a universal computer, then predicting the long-term behavior of that process must be at least as hard as solving the halting problem, which means it cannot be done. But those early results were about idealized systems, infinite lattices, perfect symmetries, mathematical constructions that physicists could dismiss as unphysical. The real systems in the lab are finite. They would say, the undecidability results only apply in the infinite limit. And there is some truth to that objection. But the objection misses the deeper point, because the question is not whether your particular experiment today encounters an undecidable problem. The question is whether the laws of physics themselves permit undecidable behavior. Whether the universe contains, as a structural feature, questions it cannot answer about itself. The result that broke the containment wall was published on December 10, 2015, in the journal Nature, volume 528, pages 207 through 211. The authors were Toby Cubitt at University College London, David Pérez-García at the Complutense University of Madrid, and Michael Wolff at the Technical University of Munich. The title was Undecidability of the Spectral Gap. I need to explain what the spectral gap is and why it matters, because this is not an obscure technical quantity. It is one of the most fundamental properties a physical system can have. In quantum mechanics, a physical system has a set of allowed energy levels called a spectrum. The ground state is the lowest energy level, the state the system occupies at absolute zero temperature. The spectral gap is the difference in energy between the ground state and the first excited state. If there is a gap, the system needs a minimum amount of energy to change its state. If there is no gap, meaning the energy levels are continuously close together all the way down to the ground state, the system can change its state with arbitrarily little energy. Whether a system is gapped or gapless determines virtually everything about its macroscopic behavior. It determines whether the material is a conductor or an insulator. It determines whether the material exhibits superconductivity or superfluidity. It determines how the material responds to magnetic fields, how it conducts heat, how it behaves at phase transitions. The spectral gap is not a minor technical parameter. It is the master switch of condensed matter physics. And Cubitt, Pérez-García, and Wolff proved that, for a family of nearest neighbor, translationally invariant Hamiltonians on a two-dimensional square lattice of finite-dimensional quantum systems, determining whether the system is gapped or gapless is undecidable. There is no algorithm that can take the description of such a system and determine in finite time whether the spectral gap exists. I want to be very precise about what this means, because it is easy to understate and important not to. This does not mean the problem is hard. This does not mean we need a bigger computer. This does not mean future physicists will crack it with better techniques. This means, with the full force of a mathematical proof, that no algorithm, no procedure, no method of any kind can answer the question in general. The spectral gap of certain quantum systems is undecidable in the same way that the halting problem is undecidable. Turing's wall, the wall he discovered in 1936 while thinking about numbers on an infinite tape, extends into the structure of physical matter. The way the proof works is itself remarkable. Cubitt, Pérez-García, and Wolf constructed a family of Hamiltonians that encode a universal Turing machine. They did this using Wang tiles, a tiling system shown to be undecidable by Robert Berger in 1966. The gap or gaplessness of the system depends on whether the encoded Turing machine halts. If it halts, the system is gapped. If it runs forever, the system is gapless. And since the halting problem is undecidable, the spectral gap is undecidable. The paper contains a sentence that I have read probably 20 times, and it still makes my skin crawl. The authors write that there exist models for which the presence or absence of a spectral gap is independent of the axioms of mathematics. Independent of the axioms. That means there are quantum systems for which you cannot determine whether they are gapped or gapless, not because you lack information, not because the experiment is too hard, but because the answer is not a consequence of the axioms of ZFC, the standard foundation of mathematics. The question has no answer within the logical system we use to describe reality. It is a Gödel sentence made of atoms. Think about what that means for physics as a discipline. Physics is supposed to be the science that explains the behavior of matter. You build a model, you derive predictions, you test them against experiment, but the spectral gap result says that for certain systems there is no model you can build, no calculation you can perform that will tell you the answer. The system has a definite physical behavior. It either conducts electricity or it does not. It is either a superconductor or it is not. But whether it is one or the other is not something any algorithm can determine. The universe knows. You cannot. Now, I need to be honest about the scope of this result, because there is a legitimate objection, and I do not want to bury it. The Hamiltonians that Cubitt, Pérez-García, and Wolf constructed are artificial. They are specifically designed to encode Turing machines. Nobody is claiming that the copper wire in your wall or the silicon in your phone has an undecidable spectral gap. The result is about what is possible within the laws of physics, not about what happens to be the case in the materials we commonly encounter. But that objection, while technically valid, misses the larger point. Before 2015, you could have believed, and most physicists did believe, that undecidability was a mathematical curiosity with no bearing on the physical world, that the universe was, in principle, completely predictable, given enough information and enough computing power, that physics had no Gödel-type limitations. The spectral gap result destroyed that belief, not by showing that a specific real material is undecidable, but by showing that the laws of physics permit undecidable behavior. The framework itself has cracks. And once you know the framework has cracks, you can never again be confident that the specific system sitting in front of you is not one of the cracked ones. And the spectral gap was not the only result. The cascade continued. In 2021, Naoto Shiraishi and Keiji Matsumoto published a paper in Nature Communications showing that a different fundamental physical question is undecidable. They proved that for a translation invariant, one-dimensional quantum system, whether the system thermalizes, that is, whether it evolves toward thermal equilibrium from a fixed product state, is undecidable. Thermalization is the process by which a physical system reaches thermo-equilibrium, the state where macroscopic properties like temperature become well defined. It is the reason your coffee cools down. It is the reason the universe has a thermodynamic arrow of time. And for certain quantum systems, whether this process happens at all is a question no algorithm can answer. Then, in early 2026, a paper appeared on arXiv, reference 2601.22761, showing undecidability in space-time geometry itself. Using the ADS/CFT correspondence, the theoretical framework connecting gravitational theories in anti-de Sitter space to conformal field theories on its boundary, the authors demonstrated that the selection of dominant bulk geometry in a class of holographic scenarios is undecidable. The undecidability is transmitted holographically from a spin Hamiltonian on the boundary. The geometry of space itself in these models inherits the computational limits that Turing discovered in 1936. In October 2024, a comprehensive review paper by Pérez-García, Cubitt, Pérez-García, and Wolf, titled Undecidability in Physics, a review appeared on arXiv. The paper surveys undecidability results across many-body quantum systems, quantum information theory, fluid mechanics, and quantum field theory. The list is long and growing, and the pattern is unmistakable. Everywhere physicists look carefully enough, in systems complex enough to encode computation, they find Turing's wall. I want to connect this explicitly to something that matters to you. The Yang-Mills existence and mass gap problem is one of the 7 Clay Millennium Prize problems, each carrying a $1 million prize. The problem asks whether quantum Yang-Mills theory, the mathematical framework underlying the standard model of particle physics, has a mass gap, a positive minimum energy for particle excitation. This is not an academic curiosity. The mass gap is the reason protons and neutrons have the masses they do. It is the reason nuclear physics works the way it works. It is the reason you have a body. And the spectral gap undecidability result bears directly on this problem. If the general question of whether quantum systems are gapped or gapless is undecidable, then the specific question of whether Yang-Mills theory has a mass gap may not have a provable axiom system. I am not saying it definitely does not. The Clay problem asks for a rigorous construction and proof, and it is possible that Yang-Mills is special enough to avoid the undecidability trap. But the possibility that one of the most important open questions in physics is not just unsolved, but unsolvable, not just beyond our current techniques, but beyond any technique, is now a live option. And it was not a live option before 2015. There is a question I keep coming back to when I think about these results, and I do not have a clean answer for it. The question is this: if the laws of physics permit undecidable behavior, and if the universe is, in some sense, running a computation, a physical process that evolves according to mathematical rules, then is the universe itself something like a Turing machine that cannot determine its own halting? Is the universe a system that contains questions it cannot answer about itself? I realize that sounds almost mystical, and I want to be careful not to slide into territory that the physics does not support. But the spectral gap result is not philosophy. It is a theorem published in Nature. And what it says is that there exist physical systems whose behavior cannot be predicted by any algorithm, not by approximation, not by simulation, not by any method at all. The physical world, the world of atoms and forces and energy levels, inherits the undecidability that Turing found in the world of symbols and tape. And this brings us back to the question I raised at the beginning. Why were you never told this? Why does every textbook, Every course, every popular account of Turing's work focus on the invention of the computer and skip past the reason the computer was invented. Why is the halting problem taught as a technical result in computer science courses and not as a fundamental statement about the limits of human knowledge? Why is the spectral gap paper, published in Nature, one of the most prestigious scientific journals on the planet, essentially unknown outside a small circle of mathematical physicists? I do not think there is a conspiracy. I think the answer is simpler and more depressing than that. The undecidability results are uncomfortable. They are uncomfortable because they say something that the modern scientific enterprise is not designed to accommodate. Science is built on the premise that questions about the natural world have answers, and that those answers are, in principle, discoverable. The undecidability results say that this premise is false. Not false for all questions, not false for the questions that physicists typically ask, but false in general. There exist questions about the physical world, well-posed, meaningful, experimentally relevant questions that have no algorithmic answer. This is not something the scientific establishment knows how to process. Grant committees do not fund research into questions that have been proved unanswerable. Textbooks do not include chapters on the things we provably cannot know. Career incentives reward scientists who solve problems, not scientists who prove problems unsolvable. And so the results sit there, published, verified, cited by specialists, and utterly invisible to the public. The reason you were never told this is not that it was disproven. It is that the implication is too uncomfortable. I want to give you a concrete analogy for what the spectral gap result actually means, because the abstract formulation, while precise, does not convey the visceral strangeness of the situation. Imagine you are a materials scientist. Your job is to predict the properties of new materials before they are synthesized. You have a quantum mechanical model of a crystal lattice. You know the atoms, you know the interactions, you know the geometry. You feed all of this into your calculation, and you ask a straightforward question. Will this material be a superconductor? Will it conduct electricity with zero resistance below a certain temperature? Before 2015, you could have believed that this question always has a computable answer. Given enough time and enough processing power, you could determine the answer from first principles. The laws of physics are mathematical. The model is well defined. The question is precise. Therefore, the answer is reachable. After 2015, you cannot believe that anymore, because the spectral gap result shows that there exist lattice models constructed within the standard framework of quantum mechanics, for which the question is, this material gapped or gapless is not just hard to answer, but provably impossible to answer by any computational method. And if you cannot determine the spectral gap, you cannot determine whether the material is a superconductor or a Mott insulator or a quantum spin liquid or any of the other exotic phases of matter that depend on the gap. Let me push this further. The spectral gap result is about lattice models in the thermodynamic limit, the idealized scenario of an infinitely large lattice. In the real world, every material is finite, so you might object that the result does not apply to real materials. And in a strict sense, you would be right. A finite system always has a definite spectral gap that is, in principle, computable. But the practical situation is more disturbing than the strict theoretical one. The spectral gap of a finite system can be exponentially sensitive to the system size. Adding one more row of atoms to your lattice can change the answer from gapped to gapless, or vice versa. And the pattern of how the gap changes as you increase the system size can be uncomputable, meaning there is no algorithm that predicts whether the gap will converge to a definite value in the large system limit or oscillate unpredictably forever. You can simulate any finite size you want, but you cannot determine from any finite collection of simulations what the infinite size answer is. The thermodynamic limit is where physics lives, and the thermodynamic limit is where undecidability hides. This has direct consequences for one of the biggest open questions in physics: high-temperature superconductivity. The mechanism that produces superconductivity in copper oxide ceramics, the cuprate superconductors discovered by Bednorz and Muller in 1986, a discovery that won them the Nobel Prize in 1987, is not understood. 4 decades of research, thousands of papers, and no consensus explanation. The cuprate phase diagram is one of the most complex and poorly understood objects in all of condensed matter physics. And the question of whether a given model of the cuprates has a spectral gap in the relevant parameter regime is, given the 2015 result, potentially undecidable. I am not claiming it is undecidable. I want to be careful about that. The specific models used for the cuprates may be simple enough to avoid the undecidability trap. But the fact that it might be undecidable, that this is now a live possibility that cannot be ruled out, changes the character of the problem. Before 2015, the failure to explain cuprate superconductivity was a failure of ingenuity. After 2015, it might be a structural impossibility. The question might not have an answer that any algorithm can find. And this connects to something even larger. The Haldane conjecture, proposed by Duncan Haldane in 1983, which won him a share of the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2016, concerns the spectral gap of antiferromagnetic spin chains. Haldane conjectured that integer spin chains are gapped, while half-integer spin chains are gapless. The conjecture has been supported by extensive numerical evidence, but has never been rigorously proved for the general case. The spectral gap undecidability result implies that a fully general proof may not be possible, because the gap question in general is undecidable. The most celebrated conjecture in quantum magnetism may live in Turing's shadow. And then there is the Yang-Mills mass gap, which I mentioned earlier but want to return to because the stakes are so high. The Clay Mathematics Institute has offered $1 million for a rigorous proof that quantum Yang-Mills theory in 4 space-time dimensions exists and has a positive mass gap. This is not just mathematics. The mass gap is the mechanism that confines quarks inside protons and neutrons. It is the reason atomic nuclei exist. It is the reason chemistry works. It is the reason you have a body. And the question of whether Yang-Mills theory has a mass gap is structurally a spectral gap question. It is asking whether the energy spectrum of the theory has a non-zero lowest excitation. And the general question of whether quantum systems have spectral gaps is undecidable. I do not want to overstate this. Yang-Mills is a specific theory, not a general family of Hamiltonians, and specific theories can have decidable gaps even when the general problem is undecidable. But the shadow is there. The possibility that one of the most important open problems in all of science might be not just unsolved, but unsolvable is a possibility that did not exist before Cubitt, Pérez-García, and Wolf published their paper. And nobody is talking about it. This is the pattern. The results get published. They get cited within the specialist community. And the wider world, the world of science communication and popular physics and education, continues as if the wall does not exist. Not because anyone is lying, because the wall is uncomfortable. Because acknowledging the wall means acknowledging that the scientific enterprise, the project of understanding the natural world through mathematical reasoning and experimental verification, has limits that are not temporary and not fixable. And that is not a message that anyone has an incentive to deliver. I want to take a moment and talk about what it feels like to sit with this, because I have been reading about these results for longer than I would like to admit, and the feeling has not gone away. It has gotten worse. When you first encounter the halting problem, it registers as a puzzle, a clever piece of mathematics. You see the diagonalization, you appreciate the elegance, and you move on. When you encounter Rice's theorem, it registers as a generalization. Interesting, broader than the halting problem, but still contained within computer science. When you encounter Chaitin's Omega, something shifts, because Omega is not abstract. It is a specific number. It sits on the number line between 0 and 1, with a definite decimal expansion. Each digit is either 0 or 1, and each digit encodes an answer that you can never know. The number exists, the answers exist, and they are unreachable. That is when the feeling starts. And when you encounter the spectral gap result, the feeling crystallizes into something harder, because the spectral gap is not about numbers on a tape. It is about atoms, about the behavior of physical matter, about the stuff your body is made of, and the stuff the ground under your feet is made of, and the stuff the stars are made of. And some of the questions you can ask about that stuff, well posed, meaningful, experimentally relevant questions, have no algorithmic answer. The wall is not just in the mathematics, it is in the physics. It is in the world. And once you see that, you start to wonder how many of the questions we have not been able to answer are questions that cannot be answered. How many of the great open problems in physics, the ones we assume are solvable with enough brilliance and enough funding and enough computing time, are actually on the wrong side of the wall? We do not know. And that is itself a deeply uncomfortable piece of ignorance. We do not have a method for determining, in general, which questions are decidable and which ones are not. The meta question, can we answer this question, is often itself unanswerable. Think about your own experience for a moment. Think about the device you are using to listen to this or watch this. That device exists because Turing imagined a universal machine. The software running on it exists because the concept of a stored program was extracted from Turing's paper and built into physical hardware. The internet that delivered this content to you is a network of Turing machines communicating with each other. Every digital technology you depend on, every app you use, every search you run, every message you send, is a computation performed by a descendant of the machine that Turing described on paper in 1936. And every one of those computations occurs inside the limits that Turing proved. Your search engine cannot, in general, determine whether a given website contains the answer to your question. Your email filter cannot, in general, determine whether a given message is spam. Your phone's operating system cannot, in general, determine whether a given app will crash. These failures are not bugs. They are theorems. They are consequences of the same proof that brought these devices into existence. You are living inside a technological civilization built on a proof of impossibility. Every convenience, every capability, every connection that digital technology provides operates within a boundary that the technology itself was designed to demonstrate. The device in your hand is both the most powerful tool ever created and a physical reminder that power has limits. And the man who showed us all of this, who found the boundary and built the blueprint and predicted the machines and anticipated the questions about artificial intelligence by decades, was punished not for what he got wrong, but for who he was. The system that should have celebrated him broke him instead. And then the system built everything it has on his ideas and forgot what those ideas actually say. There is a pattern in how institutions handle uncomfortable truths. And it is the same pattern, whether the institution is a physics department, or a legal system, or a government, or a culture. The truth arrives. It is too uncomfortable to absorb. The messenger is marginalized, suppressed, or destroyed. The truth is filed away. The implications are ignored. And then, decades later, when the truth has become undeniable, the institution issues a pardon and puts the messenger's face on currency and makes a film about their life and calls it a tragedy, as if the tragedy were an act of nature rather than a choice. Turing's story is not a tragedy in the classical sense. A tragedy involves a flaw in the hero. Turing's only flaw in the eyes of the system that destroyed him was that he existed in a way the system's rules could not accommodate. That is not a flaw. That is a Gödel sentence, a true statement that the formal system cannot prove. And the system's response was not to expand its axioms, it was to punish the statement for being true. There is one more thread I want to pull before I close this, because it connects Turing's work to something you are encountering right now, in this decade, in ways that should make you profoundly uneasy. Turing's 1950 paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, is famous for introducing the Turing test, the imitation game. But the paper does something more subtle than people usually give it credit for. Turing does not ask, "Can machines think?" He explicitly sets that question aside as too vague. Instead, he proposes a behavioral test. If a machine can imitate a human well enough to fool an interrogator, then the question of whether it really thinks becomes, in Turing's view, meaningless. The behavior is the only evidence we have for thought in other humans too. When you attribute consciousness to another person, you are doing so on the basis of their behavior. If a machine produces the same behavior, the burden of proof falls on the person who insists the machine is not thinking. Now here is the irony. In 2022, large language models descended architecturally from the neural network concepts that Turing himself explored in his 1948 paper Intelligent Machinery, began passing versions of the Turing test in practice, not in the controlled, rigorous sense that Turing specified, but in the practical sense that large fractions of ordinary people interacting with these systems cannot reliably distinguish their output from human writing. The machines that Turing described on paper in 1936, built into physical reality in 1948, and predicted would imitate human conversation by the year 2000, are now doing exactly what he said they would do. And they are doing it inside Turing's cage. Every language model, every neural network, every artificial intelligence system that has ever been built is a program running on a computer that is a physical instantiation of a Turing machine. And every one of them is subject to the halting problem, to Rice's theorem, to the fundamental limits on what any computation can determine. The machines are now sophisticated enough to mimic thought, to generate prose that reads like a person wrote it, to solve complex reasoning problems, to write code and diagnose diseases and compose music. And not one of them can solve the halting problem. Not one of them can determine in general whether a given program meets its specification. Not one of them has escaped the cage. This creates a situation that I think Turing would have found both vindicating and deeply unsettling. We have built machines that appear to think, and those machines are, provably, limited in ways that might or might not apply to human thought. If Penrose is right, and human consciousness involves non-algorithmic processes, then there are things we can do that our machines fundamentally cannot. If Penrose is wrong, and human thought is algorithmic, then we are subject to the same limits as our machines, and the wall applies to us too. Either way, the wall exists. The only question is which side of it we are on. and we do not know the answer. And there is no algorithm that can determine the answer, which means the question of whether human thought has the same limits as machine computation is itself a question that may be undecidable. Turing saw this coming. In the 1950 paper, he listed and responded to 9 objections to machine intelligence, including the theological objection, the heads in the sand objection, and the mathematical objection based on Gödel. His responses are measured, careful, and surprisingly non-committal. He does not argue that machines will definitely think. He does not argue that they definitely will not. He argues that the question is poorly posed, and that the behavioral evidence is the only kind of evidence worth considering. Reading the paper today, knowing what has happened in the intervening 76 years, what strikes me is not Turing's prescience, though that is remarkable. What strikes me is his comfort with uncertainty. A man who spent his professional life proving the existence of limits seems to have been more at peace with those limits than almost anyone who has come after him. This might be the real lesson of Turing's story, though I hesitate to use the word lesson because Turing's work suggests that some things resist being packaged into lessons. The world does not resolve into neat takeaways. Knowledge has limits. The limits are permanent, and the appropriate response to permanent limits is not despair and not denial. It is the kind of quiet, precise, intensely focused engagement with what can be known that Turing practiced his entire life. He did not shy away from the wall. He mapped it. He measured it. He described its exact contours. And then he built something extraordinary within the space the wall enclosed. But the world did not want the wall. The world wanted the computer. And so the wall was filed away and the computer was celebrated. And the man who found both was destroyed. And now I need to tell you what happened to the man who started all of this. Because the story of Alan Turing does not end with the Manchester baby, or the stored program computer, or the theoretical foundations of computer science. It ends in a small house in Wilmslow, Cheshire, with a half-eaten apple and a jar of potassium cyanide. And the way it ends is so grotesque, so needlessly cruel, that it functions almost as a parable about how institutions treat the people who show them their own limits. By 1950, Turing was at the height of his intellectual powers. He was working on the Manchester Mark I, writing some of the earliest software ever created for a stored program computer. He had published Computing Machinery and Intelligence in the journal Mind in 1950, the paper that introduced the Turing test, the imitation game, as a framework for asking whether machines can think. In that paper, he made a prediction. He wrote that by the year 2000, a digital computer with about 10 to the 9th power bits of storage could fool an average interrogator more than 30% of the time after 5 minutes of questioning. He also directly addressed and rejected the argument from Gödel, the claim that incompleteness theorems prove machines cannot match human minds, anticipating by decades the arguments of J.R. Lucas in 1961 and Roger Penrose in 1989. He was also, privately, a gay man living in a country where homosexuality was a criminal offense. The Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, specifically Section 11, the same statute that had been used to prosecute Oscar Wilde in 1895, made gross indecency between males punishable by up to 2 years of imprisonment with hard labor. In January 1952, Turing's house in Wilmslow was burgled. He reported it to the police. During the investigation, it emerged that Turing was in a relationship with a 19-year-old man named Arnold Murray. The police, rather than pursuing the burglary, pursued Turing. He was charged with 3 counts of gross indecency, contrary to Section 11 of the Criminal Law Amendment Act. The case was heard at the Sessions House in Knutsford on March 31, 1952. Case name: Regina versus Turing and Murray. Turing pleaded guilty. He was given a choice: prison or chemical castration. He chose the latter. The court imposed 12 months of probation, conditional on a course of hormone treatment with stilbostrol, which is diethylstilbostrol, a synthetic estrogen. The injections caused gynecomastia, the growth of breast tissue. They functioned as a cerebral depressant. They were designed to destroy his sex drive, and they succeeded. He was also stripped of his GCHQ security clearance, effectively cutting him off from the classified work that had occupied the most consequential years of his career. I want to state this plainly because the clinical language of historical accounts can sometimes obscure the barbarity. The British government took the man who had helped save their country during the war, the man who had invented the theoretical foundation of every computer they would ever build, the man whose work at Bletchley Park had shortened World War II by an estimated 2 years and saved an estimated 14 million lives. And they chemically castrated him because he was gay. They injected him with a female hormone to suppress his sexuality, and then they took away his ability to do the secret work that gave his life meaning. On the morning of June 8, 1954, Turing's cleaner, Eliza Clayton, arrived at his home at 43 Adlington Road, Wilmslow, and found him dead in his bed. He was 41 years old. The post-mortem examination found cyanide poisoning. A half-eaten apple lay on the bedside table. The apple was never tested for cyanide. This is a fact that not enough people know. The single most iconic detail of Turing's death, the image that has become the symbol of his story, was never forensically examined. The inquest the following day returned a verdict of suicide. He was cremated at Woking on June 12, 1954. His ashes were scattered in the garden of the crematorium, the same garden where his father's ashes had been scattered. Andrew Hodges, whose 1983 biography, Alan Turing, the Enigma, remains the definitive account, connects the apple to Turing's lifelong fascination with the 1937 Disney film Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and specifically to the scene where the Wicked Queen immerses her apple in the poisonous brew. David Levitt's biography draws the same connection. The image is almost unbearably symbolic. A man who had spent his life thinking about computation, about the mechanical processes of logic and decision, choosing a death that references a fairy tale about poisoned knowledge. But the suicide verdict is not certain. Jack Copeland, a philosopher of computing at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand and the editor of The Essential Turing, has argued that the post-mortem evidence is more consistent with accidental inhalation of cyanide fumes. Turing had a home laboratory where he performed gold electroplating experiments using potassium cyanide. Copeland points out that Turing had laid out a to-do list for the Tuesday after his death, and that his friend Robin Gandy described him as having seemed, if anything, happier than usual the previous weekend. His mother, Sarah Turing, went to her grave insisting it was an accident. I do not know how Turing died. Nobody does. The evidence permits suicide, accident, and though this is rarely discussed, more sinister possibilities involving a state that had ample reason to fear what a disgraced former codebreaker with a grudge might do with his knowledge of classified operations. What I do know is that a man who should have been celebrated as one of the greatest intellects of the 20th century was instead prosecuted, humiliated, chemically violated, and found dead at 41, and that the country he saved did not apologize for 55 years. In 2009, following a petition organized by computer scientist John Graham Cumming that gathered over 30,000 signatures. Prime Minister Gordon Brown issued a public apology. Brown's statement acknowledged the appalling way Turing had been treated. On December 24, 2013, Queen Elizabeth II granted Turing a posthumous royal pardon under the royal prerogative of mercy. And on January 31, 2017, the Policing and Crime Act received royal assent. Sections 164 through 166, informally called Turing's Law, granted automatic posthumous pardons to approximately 49,000 men who had been convicted under laws criminalizing consensual homosexual acts that are no longer offenses. Living individuals received a disregard and pardon process. 49,000 men. The legal system that destroyed Turing was not a single aberration. It was a machine, and it processed 49,000 cases that we know about. Turing was the most famous. He was not the most suffering. I want to come back now to the parallel between Turing's life and his work, because I think it illuminates something that the purely technical history misses. Turing proved that there are questions no algorithm can answer. He proved that knowledge has structural limits, and then he lived the rest of his life inside a society that had its own structural limits, its own undecidable questions. The British legal system of the 1950s could not compute a world in which a man could be both a war hero and a homosexual. It could not process the input, and so it did what any machine does when it encounters an input it cannot handle. It broke. The parallel is not a metaphor. It is a structural observation. Institutions, like formal systems, operate within a set of rules, and when the world presents them with a case that falls outside those rules, the system does not expand to accommodate it. It punishes the case for existing. Turing was a Gödel sentence, walking through a formal system that could not prove him, and the system's response was to try to erase him. There is a myth, and I want to address it because it circulates widely, that the Apple logo, the rainbow-striped bitten apple that Rob Janoff designed for Apple Computer in 1977, is a tribute to Alan Turing. Steve Jobs was asked about this directly. His response, as quoted by Janoff himself, was, "It is not true, but God, we wish it were." The logo is not a tribute, but the fact that people want it to be tells you something about the emotional weight of the story. The image of Turing, the apple, and the computer is too perfect, too symbolic, too narratively complete, not to be real. But it is not. The world is under no obligation to arrange itself into satisfying stories. Another lesson you might take from Turing's work. Let me tell you about one more thing Turing did, because it connects the personal and the theoretical in a way I find almost unbearable. In his 1950 paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, Turing addresses the Gödel objection directly. The argument, which would later be elaborated by Lucas and Penrose, goes like this. For any consistent formal system, there exists a true statement, the Gödel sentence, that the system cannot prove. A human mathematician can see that the Gödel sentence is true by stepping outside the system. Therefore, the human mind is not a formal system. Therefore, no Turing machine can replicate what a human mind can do. Turing's response, written 2 years before his prosecution, is remarkable for its humility. He does not claim machines can match human thought. He does not claim they cannot. What he says is that the argument, even if valid, only establishes that a machine cannot do everything a human can. It does not establish what a machine can or cannot do in specific cases. And then he makes a move that I think is the most revealing sentence he ever wrote. He says, in effect, that even humans are not consistent. We make errors, we contradict ourselves, we fail to recognize our own Gödel sentences all the time. The argument from Gödel assumes a perfection in human reasoning that does not exist. A man who would soon be broken by the contradictions of his own society, writing about the contradictions inherent in the claim that humans are consistent formal systems. I do not know whether Turing saw the irony. I suspect he did. He was not a man who missed ironies. Penrose revived the Gödel argument in 1989 in his book The Emperor's New Mind, and elaborated it in 1994 in Shadows of the Mind. Penrose went further than Lucas, arguing that the non-algorithmic ingredient in human consciousness must originate in quantum gravity effects, specifically in objective collapse of the wave function. The mathematical logician Solomon Pfefferman attacked Penrose's argument in a 1995 paper in the journal Psych, challenging it on multiple grounds, including the mathematical validity of the Gödelian reasoning itself. Hilary Putnam and Stuart Shapiro raised related objections. The argument remains influential among philosophers, but is not a consensus position among logicians or physicists. But here is what I find striking about the whole debate. Whether you agree with Penrose or with his critics, everyone in the conversation accepts the same starting premise. Turing's result is correct. The halting problem is unsolvable. Formal systems have limits. The only disagreement is about whether human minds share those limits or transcend them. That is the question Turing's work forces us to ask. And 90 years later, we still do not have an answer, which means the halting problem, in a sense, applies to itself. The question of whether human thought has limits is a question we have not been able to resolve. We do not know whether we can know. We are stuck in a loop, and the loop was created by a 23-year-old lying in a meadow by the River Cam in the summer of 1935, thinking about what it means to follow an instruction. There is a reading of this story that I think most people would prefer. In that reading, Turing is a tragic hero. He discovered something profound, was destroyed by a cruel society, and was eventually vindicated by history. The pardon, the apology, the £50 note with his face on it, the statue at Bletchley Park, the Broadway play, the Hollywood film. The arc bends toward justice. The story has a resolution. I do not think that reading is accurate. I think the real reading is worse. The real reading is this: Turing discovered a permanent limit on what can be known. Not a temporary limit. Not a limit that will yield to better technology or more funding or cleverer thinking. A limit that is built into the structure of mathematics, and as we now know, built into the structure of physical reality. And then the world went on, as if he had not. The computer was extracted from his proof and turned into a tool for answering questions. The proof that some questions have no answers was set aside, filed in the foundations of mathematics cabinet, and largely forgotten by the culture that benefited most from the machine. Every device you own is descended from a thought experiment designed to prove that knowledge has a boundary. Every search engine query you type is processed by a machine that exists because a man proved that some queries cannot be answered. Every algorithm you interact with, every piece of software you use, every AI system that generates text or classifies images or drives a car, operates inside the limits that Turing drew in 1936. None of them can solve the halting problem. None of them can escape Rice's theorem. None of them can compute Chaitin's Omega. They are all, every single one, bounded by the wall that Turing found. And the wall is not just in the machines. The 2015 spectral gap result means the wall is in physics, in the structure of matter, in the behavior of atoms at the quantum level. The universe itself contains questions it cannot answer about itself, properties of physical systems that are well-defined, that have definite values, but that no algorithm can determine. You are sitting inside a universe that provably contains unreachable knowledge, not hidden knowledge, not knowledge that requires a better instrument or a longer calculation, knowledge that is structurally inaccessible, that exists as a feature of reality, but lies permanently beyond the reach of any process, any machine, any mind that operates by following rules. Turing found that wall. He found it when he was 23. He described it in 36 pages. And then the world built the most powerful technology in human history on top of it, and pretended the wall was not there. On the morning of June 8th, 1954, a cleaner found a man dead in his bed in a house in Wilmslow, with a half-eaten apple beside him. The apple was never tested. The questions it might have answered were never asked. And the man who had spent his life proving that some questions cannot be answered was himself rendered into an unanswered question, a halting problem that the system that destroyed him never bothered to solve. The machines he imagined are everywhere now. They are in your pocket. They are in your walls. They are in the air between satellites and the wires under the ocean. They connect every part of human civilization to every other part. They do things that Turing could not have dreamed of, and they do all of it inside the cage he built when he proved that cages were necessary. There are things computation cannot reach. There are things physics cannot decide. There are properties of matter that no algorithm can determine. There are numbers that exist but cannot be read. There is a function that grows faster than anything growth can describe. And there is a dead man in Wilmslow who knew all of this before any of it had names. The wall is real. It was proved in 1936. It was confirmed in 1953, and in 1970, and in 1975, and in 2015, and in 2021, and in 2024, and again in 2026. It is not going away. It is a permanent feature of the universe you live in, and the device you are using to hear these words is the proof